Now it's for America's favorite thing to talk about, the bureaucracy. Just kidding. Almost everybody hates the bureaucracy, but I don't know why. The bureaucracy is absolutely fascinating because we have to get the job of government done. We have to do the work. The bureaucracy is just the way that we do it. Now, we're going to talk about theories of bureaucratic organization. We're going to talk about why we have the bureaucracy, but importantly, we have a federal bureaucracy because we have a federal government. We have a state bureaucracy because we have a state government. We have a local bureaucracy because we have a local government. We also have private bureaucracies because bureaucracy is simply the way that we organize work, the hierarchy and the structure that we organize work. In fact, you probably have this happen to you all the time when you organize a group project. When you plan a party, you start delegating tasks in organization, try and figure out how to get as much out of this organization as you can, assign tasks and roles, and get feedback to get that thing done. Now, there's all sorts of different ways that we can think about the bureaucracy, but Max Weber thought about rules and procedures, hierarchy, about which level should have which types of responsibility, increased specialization, and how we build interpersonal relationships. Barnard talked about conscious coordination of activities, the importance of leaders who lead into the bureaucracy, and this whole principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem is this. Somebody enlists the help of somebody to get some work done. So the person at the top is called the principal. The principal enlists the help of the agent does the work and then reports back to the principal. Now the principal is somebody who has power or resources. Those power and resources like money can be used to get some work done. Like, for example, the IT department. An organization needs an information technology department, but they don't have necessarily a specialized skills. So that agency hires a group to work as an IT department. The IT department is highly specialized and they know all the details, ins and outs of IT, and then they come back and return a report. The problem there is that the IT department can also hide their behavior. We don't know if they're doing a good job because the computers work. Well, do the computers work because there are problems or not? Well, inherently in all bureaucracies, lower levels have the incentive to hide their behavior from the higher levels. And the higher levels have to investigate and they have to do some work. Some of that problem can be solved by leadership. Some of that problem can be solved by writing good contracts. But bureaucracies are essentially designed to be efficient, but they have built-in problems that cause inefficiency. Wilson talked about that, and they said essentially every organization is going to have some output. They're going to do things. What we hope is that those things that they do create outcomes or changes in behavior. Now, you should look at that, and those theories in the book, I think they're really important. Initially, the federal bureaucracy was very small. Like, we hired an army. We hired a navy. We needed someone to collect taxes, but we had to set that up. So Congress has the power to grant agencies the right to exist, and then the president runs those agencies. What happened is over time Congress has passed more laws. We've had more agencies to do more of the work. Now the executive branch departments assist the president in doing the work of the law. And Congress gets to approve who leads those agencies. Now Congress, since they approve who gets to serve in those positions, it's really important that they choose good people. And the president can remove some of those people. They can ask for their resignation. In fact, we've seen that with other presidents as they've asked for certain heads of departments to resign. That's part of their ability to execute the laws. Congress creates agencies, but they get to change. And if they want more agencies, they build more agencies. But the president manages them. Now, as agencies shift that work, sometimes we get reorganization efforts. For example, under the Bush presidency, the W. Bush presidency, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, and they pulled different agencies from different departments, some other places from like the Treasury or from the Justice Department. They put them in the Department of Homeland Security to help coordinate that work. Can they do that? Absolutely. Congress has the ability to tell agencies to exist or not exist, to get rid of agencies or to restructure them. And every time we change the relationship of one agency inside the organization, it changes its power. And there become turf wars because we have a limited amount of funding. So each agency is trying to do the best work it can in order to get better a better budget the following year. Sometimes even agencies don't like each other. For example, the New York Police Department historically has never liked the fire department, because if the fire department looks good, the police feel like that they don't look good enough. So if the police department looks better than the fire department, then the fire department gets jealous and they fight over resources. Well, initially, early on, when we tried to figure out like how agencies would work, we had to figure out how we would staff those agencies and how we would hire them. And under Andrew Jackson, we started this idea, at least at the federal level, it came from other cities too, that people who won elections, the winners, would be able to get to staff the bureaucracy with supporters. So those supporters got to get jobs because they helped the person get elected. This is more closely related to the Weberian description, but essentially the spoil system caused a problem because every time someone would get elected or re-elected, those people would get kicked out of office and you'd have to hire a whole new group of friends. It created a significant amount of instability. So this growth in the bureaucracy and the changes, we created a new system, part of the Pendleton Civil Service Act. But we also created some agencies like independent regulatory agencies. Like, for example, the CIA is an independent agency. Independent regulatory agency like the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They regulate the communication systems, the utilities that provide communication systems. We created them outside the influence of the president or of Congress. So essentially they get set up. We created them that way so that they didn't get messed with. So presidents couldn't fiddle around with them. One of the biggest ones is the Social Security Administration. I want to give you this example right now because I love independent agencies. Independent agencies are out of control. Congress gives them power, the president gives them power, and then nobody can check their power. This is why when we empowered the Social Security Administration to help old people and give them benefits, we didn't want the president to fiddle with those benefits, or Congress, because if you fiddle with the benefits, you fiddle with old people. And guess what? Old people vote more. So a president could essentially rig the voting system by giving old people more benefits at the time that he needs to get reelected, or members of Congress get reelected. So the way that we structure the bureaucracy really, really matters. So what happened is trying to grow out of these independent agencies, trying to grow out of political patronage, just giving people jobs because they were your supporters. We said, wouldn't it be better if we hired people based on merit? And so the Pendleton Civil Service Act essentially established a system where we would hire the best people for the job, not related to who they knew or what political connections they had. So what happened in that is we set up systems to protect them against political influence. What does that mean? It means that if there was a Republican who was elected to office, they couldn't just hire Republicans to fill the jobs in the bureaucracy. And that couldn't be a test for whether or not they were doing a good job. Like if they were doing a bad job, they couldn't say, well, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? If you are, we're going to fire you. They couldn't do that. So increasingly what's happened is there are a lot of protections built in for civil servants or people who work in the government that are intended to protect them so that they'll do a good job, but maybe make it difficult for people to get fired. So essentially, what's happened over time is the federal bureaucracy or federal employment and people who work in government jobs has grown, in part because we've asked the Congress and the legislature in all the states and the executive branch has asked for government to do more work. And as they do more work, we have to hire more people, and that means there are more agencies to do that work. Specifically after World War II, we started rolling out programs to help people and improve quality of life. So it expanded the military, expanded social services, expanded the way that we intervene in the economy, and we regulate the economy. So we've grown the federal bureaucracy. You should read about a lot of stuff in the book. I've already talked about independent agencies. It's really this complex web of departments and organizations, and it's really hierarchical. So inside each department, there are agencies. There are also these things called government corporations that run independent of the government more or less, but they're funded by the government. They're run like any other business except they're owned by the government. We also have not just agencies and departments, but sometimes those agencies and departments, they hire private contractors. For example, the Army doesn't build its own tanks. The Air Force doesn't build its own airplanes. We hire contractors to build those airplanes for us. Sometimes we even hire corporations, like private profit-making corporations, to do the work of government. We have privately owned prisons that make a profit on some of our prisoners. We have government contractors who design the software that run tanks. All of that is part of the bureaucracy, but it's not really government employees. They're just funded by the government. So you should look at the structure of the federal bureaucracy. At the very top, they have the executive political appointees, senior executive service. Then we have sort of the grunt work laborers, the general service employees. Really what they do is they implement the law. They can only do what Congress tells them to do. So if we pass a law that regulates televisions, then an agency that goes and regulates televisions, they hire employees and they go inspect television factories or they inspect broadcast systems. They are the frontline, street-level bureaucrats. They go out and do the work of the government. Now, Congress, when they pass a law, in order to get it passed, they have to make compromises. To get this group of people who have different ideas, they make, to agree on something, they make compromises, which means that often legislation is vague. When it's vague, it means that Congress gives power to an agency to do a vague task. That agency has to create a system where they can implement that law that's in a way that's fair. So they write rules about how they implement laws. And the bureaucracy really believes that they also have to represent citizens and do what's best for citizens. So they write rules and laws that can be applied generally. They write rules to implement the law or to get the job done. So it's fair. So, for example, if we're passing a firearms law that bans certain types of weapons, the agency, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they have to write rules that apply to all gun makers equally. So they say, it can't have this type of stock, it can't take this kind of bullets, it can't use this kind of, bayonet lugs, and they apply to all those guns. And not the manufacturers. So Colt or Bushmaster or any of the other gun manufacturers, they can't say, well, you're discriminating against me because the bureaucracy is trying to implement the laws all equally. So here's a picture of how that hierarchy in federal bureaucracy works. The bureaucracy is generally seen as a whole system of ways to stop you from doing things. There's so many rules you have to comply with, all these hoops you have to jump through. Like, think about your last trip to the Department of Motor Vehicles. You had to show up, show your paperwork, then you had to wait in line. Then you had to pay your fee and show them the paperwork, and you had to wait in line. Then you had to wait in line for a picture. Then you had to wait in line for a test. Then you had to wait in line for all those lines and all those procedures are actually designed to be efficient, but in their design to be efficient, sometimes they feel inefficient. And there's some concerns about whether or not departments fight against each other too much, or whether or not there's corruption or nepotism inside those agencies. So ultimately, the bureaucracy sets up systems to make things fair, and in those systems to make things fair and equal, we set up rules and procedures that are often inefficient. Now, one of the bigger concerns is whether or not a regulatory agency or an agency that goes to implement the law, if they sometimes become captured by the people that they regulate. We talked about that in terms of interest groups, but this is a big concern. All federal agencies are overseen, all state agencies and city agencies are overseen by elected officials. That's part of the separation of powers. The elected officials gave them power to do that work. The bureaucracy has to return and report and tell those elected officials how they've used that power. So the president has power to appoint heads. They have power to increase, decrease budgets through the budgeting process. They have executive orders to tell how the bureaucracy should function. Congress exercises its oversight by confirming those heads through lawmaking, but then they investigate agencies to see if they've done things that are wrong. So General Services Administration did something not too long ago where they spent a lot of money, and the congressional committee that oversees the GSA called them in and said, why did you spend that money? Why were you doing these things? And so Congress can encourage the bureaucracy or those agencies to do things that they want them to do. The the judicial branch also exercises oversight by settling lawsuits, by hearing cases where, say, a police department has done something that they think are inappropriate, and there's a ruling The judicial branch gets to see whether or not that agency acted appropriately or inappropriately. And the bureaucracy is also under scrutiny all the time by media. So there's some, bad story about a police department, or the FDA doesn't approve a drug, or does approve a drug, importantly. Media coverage is important, but it's limited. And mostly it's limited because citizens don't have a lot of attention to, bureaucratic agencies. We've tried all sorts of ways to reform the bureaucracy to make it more efficient. That gave power back to the states, reduce the amount of regulation, reinvent it. We've tried to privatize it, and fundamentally there are differences.